After sitting on the shelf being neglected for almost a year, I'm pleased to finally say this is the Acer Aspire 3, and when I bought this unit it was one of the cheapest laptops on the Australian market at only $498. Not that we're going to go any easier on it just because it was cheap. This particular model includes a 1080p LCD display, Ryzen 3 7320U, and 8GB of DDR5 RAM. Design-wise, you're looking at a typical big square slab of a 15.6-inch laptop, clad in silver-painted ABS plastic with contrasting black trim. I quite like the way Acer's current design language extensively uses flat surfaces and sharp creases and angles, but unfortunately it also features one of the stupidest designs in the laptop industry. A pointed drop hinge that hits the surface the laptop's sitting on when it's open beyond about 100 degrees, concentrating the majority of the weight on an obnoxiously sharp edge. This hinge design ostensibly improves ergonomics and airflow on a desk, but in reality when the display is set to most angles, it lifts the base up so little that it's not really helping at all for either of those purposes, and it only serves to add a ton of discomfort to laptop use and an extra shock load to the hinges every time it bonks the desk. Stop it. Dimensions are on the flabbier side for a basic machine like this, not helped by the unusually thick bezels around the display. Weight is a little higher than usual too, but in this case that's actually a good sign. Included in the very recyclable double-boxed packaging are the laptop itself, a tiny 45-watt power adapter, and once again there's the extra fancy step of opening a sealed envelope to expose a basic setup guide and warranty information. This laptop arrived with no visible manufacturing defects or functional issues, so this one gets full marks for quality control. Connectivity is dead on average for a lower-end laptop. HDMI support is not specified by Acer for some reason, but it does appear to be HDMI 1.4, which doesn't support 4K at 60Hz. Thankfully, this one's free of an infestation of USB 2.0 ports, and the USB-C port supports charging and DisplayPort output. The only ports that are somewhat modular on this machine are the right-hand side USB Type-A and headphone jack, which are both mounted on a separate board, and the DC-in jack, although this one requires the hinge to be unbolted before it can be removed. If any of the other ports on the left-hand side are broken, it's time to get out the soldering iron. Input devices on this laptop are not disgusting. The multi-touch diving board style clickpad fitted here works well. Tracking is reasonably accurate, the button is easy to press over the vast majority of the surface, and clicks are quiet and free of any rattling or phantom double clicks. To keep things feeling nice and firm, the trackpad is backed by a very thick plastic frame, and the entire forward edge of the palm rest is backed with molded in reinforcement structure to stiffen the area as much as possible. Sometimes this isn't successful, but in this case it works. Good stuff. The keyboard is a mostly full-size unit, but with a significantly squashed numpad. This number is so narrow that it's difficult to use from muscle memory, which diminishes the point of it being there in the first place. The rest of the keycaps are all distinctly undersized, and the function key row is absolutely tiny. Nonetheless, the typing experience is one that's completely acceptable. Keys offer minimal feedback and are very light to press, but the keyboard deck feels like it's fixed in place well, and it doesn't noticeably bend or rattle in any way while you're typing. That above-average feeling of solidity is helped by a surprisingly large metal backplate underneath the keyboard, attached to the case by an enormous amount of plastic welds. Of course, this does mean it's close to impossible to replace just the keyboard if it wears out or breaks, but in this case it's a pretty good compromise to get a distinctly solid feeling to the construction. Lastly, I'm pleased to say that Acer have had the good sense to use white print against black keys, so despite the annoying lack of a backlight, the keyboard is still very easy to see in most lighting conditions. Completely failing to pass the YouTuber standard one-hand opening test, the Aspire 3's lid requires a very high 891 grams of force to lift from fully closed, which is enough to bend the entire display like a banana if it's open from a point in the center. Moving it from 90 degrees requires 338 grams, followed by a spike to 441 when the feet hit the desk and begin lifting the chassis. When the display is being held up by just the hinges, there's a noticeable amount of display wobble, but when it's resting on its stupid little lid feet, that wobble is reduced to almost nothing. So we've found the positive to this otherwise silly design. Now, hinge durability on this one is a little bit interesting. The surface area of the hinge brackets in the lowercase assembly is minimal, and there are disappointingly only 3 screws on each side. However, the screw bosses are all braced by a stiff metal backplate, meaning they'll be less likely to suffer fatigue from stress over time as they're forced to share the load equally. In fact, if you look closely, you'll see that almost all of the screw bosses in this area are braced by this metal plate. This is a very good design, and it's pretty unusual to see this sort of attention to detail in such an otherwise cheaply manufactured machine. Inside the display assembly behind the bezel, things are looking pretty good. In fact, Acer have gone above and beyond here, ticking off every single checkbox for good hinge design in a plastic laptop. 4 screws per side bolt the thick hinge bracket into thick screw bosses, which hook firmly into the bracket via a secondary metal brace, which then extends into full-height L-shaped braces, which are not only bolted into the lid above the display, helping to distribute loads vertically, but which then also run the full width of the display panel. Putting this side by side with, for example, the same area in MSI's GF63, the difference in engineering is night and day. But will it still break? Well, probably. All plastic-framed laptops are likely to suffer from a hinge failure sooner or later, and bashing the lid against the desk all the time like this isn't going to help this one. Throwing a bigger bucket of sewage over Acer's victory parade, the LCD display that's propped up by those nice hinges is another horrible TN panel from the dark ages. Once again, there's no contrast ratio to speak of, it doesn't successfully cover any standard color gamut, and peak brightness might have been impressive in 2006. You should never buy a laptop with a TN panel in this day and age. IPS-type displays are now the bare minimum acceptable standard, and this then is unacceptable. Mounted above the appalling display is an appalling webcam and stereo microphones. You already know exactly what to expect from these, so they don't exactly disappoint. The sound system installed in the Aspire 3 is the usual basic 2-channel 2-speaker setup firing downwards at the front of the palm rest. Speaker drivers themselves are the totally generic cheap little oval units that are a plague everywhere from this sort of machine all the way up to high-priced mid-range gaming laptops. The enclosures are fairly small and they aren't screwed or clipped in at all, instead they're simply smooshed into place using strips of thin foam tape. Responsible for driving these is a tiny little Realtek ALC356 chip. No datasheet is readily available for this one, so I was unable to get exact specifications, but subjectively, audio from both the internal speakers and to some extent the headphone output is extremely weak and tinny, and distinctly worse than the category average. The included storage is an M2 2280 form factor 1/4TB Micron SSD. This unit uses a Phison controller equipped with no DRAM cache and a single chip of Micron TLC NAND flash. This drive is definitely small, slow, and unimpressive. No heatsink or thermal pad is provided for the SSD, and there's no slot for a second drive. Wireless connectivity is provided by a socketed Azure Wave chip using a MediaTek chipset which supports AX Wi-Fi and Bluetooth 5.1. Just like HP, Acer seems to have jumped on the bandwagon of handing off power mode controls to the operating system, so the remaining functionality of the Acer Sense software is minimal. Really, there's nothing more useful than battery charge limiting here, and even that is bizarrely gimped into an automatic system instead of a charge stop preset. And on the subject of software, check out the size of the crapware loadout on this one. None of this benefits you, and this is yet another laptop that would benefit from a drive wipe and clean OS install on day one. The 41 Wh battery fitted to this unit is still reporting 41 Wh of capacity after calibrating over a few charge cycles. With the display set to its low maximum brightness and sitting idle on the Windows desktop, the Aspire 3 managed 9 hours and 53 minutes of runtime. During my usual heavy internet usage test, which is wildly unscientific, it quit after 6 hours and 55 minutes. Not bad, not great. Charging from empty, the battery takes 39 minutes to hit 50%, 1 hour 15 minutes to hit 80%, and is full after 1 hour 55 minutes. And when it finally wears out, the battery is extremely easy to replace, too easy in fact. It's held in by only 2 screws at the top, which allows it to flop about quite a bit inside the case. Truly next level cost cutting. Processor included here is the extremely tiny little AMD Ryzen 3 7320U. This microscopic chip is based on the ancient Zen 2 architecture from 2019, but it's made on TSMC's more recent 6nm process and supports modern LPDDR5 memory. The chip is fed by a 2+1 phase power supply, which should be more than enough. RAM supplied with this unit is 8GB of LPDDR5 5500 in the form of a pair of Micron chips soldered permanently to the motherboard in a dual channel configuration. Socketed memory is not supported by this CPU, so it's stuck at 8GB forever, but at least this RAM is reasonably fast. The integrated GPU is AMD's Radeon 610M, which is a tiny little 128 shader unit based on AMD's excellent RDNA 2 architecture. With so few shaders and a fixed maximum clock speed of 1.9 GHz, you shouldn't expect much from this chip, but it does technically fully support DirectX 12 Ultimate, including ray tracing. The system tasked with extracting heat from the CPU is a typical simple arrangement with a single heat pipe wicking heat away from the CPU to a heat spreader, which uses one fan to exhaust heat out the back of the chassis towards the hinge. That single fan is surprisingly large for this class of laptop, but since it only breathes from the vents on the bottom case underneath, it's quite easy to totally block the airflow. Likewise, the heat exchanger is fairly beefy, but on the other end of the heat pipe is an absolutely diminutive little copper cold plate. This is easily the smallest cold plate I've ever seen. Acer didn't waste a cent on this one. The contact surface is very well finished with only a few very shallow visible scuffs and no pitting. VRM components are not contacted at all. Without the fan, the cooler weighs a very low 26 grams. Less weight means less thermal mass or less capacity for the cooler to absorb spikes in heat without ramping up the fan speed. Now, the Aspire 3, like all laptops in its class, is probably not intended for heavy sustained workloads or gaming, but that doesn't mean we can't be mildly abusive to it to see what happens. Kicking things off, I've subjected it to a 30-minute stress test running Cinebench R23 on a loop while the laptop sits flat on a desk in its highest performance mode. Since there's no separate GPU, I haven't run a GPU test at the same time, so 100% of the power budget will be aimed at those processor cores. And would you look at that, an absolutely rock solid and surprisingly high 25 watts is delivered to the CPU throughout the entire test start to finish. Core sensor readouts are kept secret on this machine, so we're using package temperature this time around, but it's just as stable as the power delivery. The cooling system is aiming for 90 degrees and it holds onto it like its life depends on it. Given that we're pumping a whole 25 watts into a tiny little chip, you won't be surprised to learn that core frequencies are held very high, clinging on to the maximum boost of 4.1 GHz the whole time. After a long run at full load, VRM component temperatures are kept nice and low despite the lack of active cooling, with temperatures barely exceeding 60 degrees on the MOSFETs. And likewise, external skin temperatures are kept well under control, barely deviating from ambient temperature for the most part, with only small hotspots on both the top and the bottom reaching over 35 degrees. Now, despite being near the top of the charts here for power consumption, this chip completely fails to translate that power into something resembling high performance. Under load, this machine is pretty much throwing an electronic tantrum and forcefully ejecting all of the power efficiency out of its cot onto the floor where it shatters into a million tiny pieces. Naughty. Nonetheless, it's not too bad for general tasks and even capable of playing back the FL Studio demo track without a single pause or stutter. That's close to all you can expect at this price point, but if you don't load it up too heavily, performance is completely acceptable. As for gaming performance, well, despite the modern GPU architecture, there's only so much you can do with 128 shader cores. In a modern context, yeah, that's close to nothing, and scores in 3D Mark's Firestrike and TimeSpy benchmarks are almost impressively low at somewhere around half what the already slow Radeon Vega 7 scores in the same tests. You aren't going to be playing any modern games on this one. On the flip side, in a game from 9 years ago, and yes, Dying Light has accidentally become my default potato gaming benchmark, it's almost surprisingly good, banging out a pretty much playable 30 to 40 FPS, albeit on the lowest possible settings at 720p resolution. That's still bad, but I expected worse. So what have we learned here? Well, coming as a bit of a surprise, the Aspire 3 is not completely horrible. Input devices are entirely usable, build quality is up to an acceptable standard, and durability looks to have been more than just an afterthought in the design of this machine. I could almost imagine this being a tolerable laptop, if not for the presence of that god-awful TN display which does its best to make you hate every second you spend on this thing. In spite of that display though, I'm awarding this one an official Nuclear Notebook rating of less shit than I expected. It could have been worse, but it wasn't.